The first thing you noticed about the trauma bay wasn't the blood or the frantic rhythm of the nurses. It was the silence that seemed to radiate from Dr. Evelyn Elias. She stood across the room, her surgical mask pulled down, exposing the sharp, unyielding line of her jaw. The air between us felt pressurized, heavy enough to crush a lung. She wasn't looking at the patient chart in her hands. She was looking at me. Her gaze was physical, a tactile weight that traced the line of my throat and settled in the hollow of my chest. It was the kind of look that stripped away the professional armor I'd spent 5 years welding to my skin. I felt exposed, pinned under a microscope that wasn't looking for pathology, but for weakness. Then, the pager on my hip vibrated against my bone, a sharp electronic scream that shattered the moment and pulled us back into the war. To understand the tension, you have to understand the architecture of our world at 2 a.m. The surgical wing of St. Jude's doesn't sleep. It just hums, at a lower, more dangerous frequency. The fluorescent lights hum with a sound that grates against your nervous system, and the air is always kept at a refrigeration level that makes your skin prickle. It's a sterile, white landscape of linoleum and stainless steel, designed to be easily wiped clean of human error and human fluids. And Dr. Elias was the queen of this frozen kingdom. She had a reputation that preceded her entrance into any room, brilliant, exacting, and terrifyingly precise. They called her the scalpel behind her back, not just because of her hands, but because of her personality. She didn't converse, she cut. She cut through pleasantries, through excuses, and through the fragile egos of residents until she found the truth. I had been her chief resident for 6 months, and in that time, I felt like I had been dissected daily. But lately, the dynamic had shifted. The professional critiques had taken on a different cadence. It wasn't just about my suture technique or my diagnostic speed anymore. It was the way she would stand too close during rounds, the scent of her expensive sandalwood perfume cutting through the antiseptic smell of the ward. It was the way she would correct my hand placement in the OR, her gloved fingers lingering on my wrist for a second longer than necessary, checking my pulse as if it were a vital sign she needed to monitor personally. We were in a Cold War. On the surface, we were the model of a high-functioning surgical team, efficient, communicative, professional. But underneath, there was a current of electricity that made every interaction feel like a potential detonation. I was exhausted, running on caffeine and adrenaline, my body aching from a double shift. But whenever she entered the room, my senses spiked. I was hyper-aware of her location in the unit at all times, tracking her movement like a radar system designed to detect an incoming missile. I walked toward the nurse's station, rubbing the back of my neck, trying to work out a knot of tension that had been living there since my shift began. That's when I saw Dr. Sterling. He was leaning against the counter, reviewing a file, looking like the only warm thing in this entire hospital. Sterling was the director of trauma, my mentor since med school, and the closest thing I had to a father figure in this city. He was soft-spoken, rumpled in a way that suggested he prioritized comfort over style, and possessed a patience that Elias seemed to view as a character flaw. "You look like you're holding the ceiling up with your shoulders, Vance," Sterling said without looking up from the chart, his voice a low rumble of comfort. "Just another night in paradise," I murmured, leaning my hip against the counter near him. Being around Sterling was a relief. It was safe. It was the only place in the hospital where I didn't feel like I had to be perfect. I could just be tired. I could just be human. With Elias, I felt like I was constantly performing a high-wire act without a net. With Sterling, I was on solid ground. "Elias riding you hard tonight?" he asked, finally looking up, his eyes crinkling at the corners with sympathy. "She's thorough," I deflected. I couldn't tell him that thorough didn't cover the way she watched me scrub in, or the way her voice dropped an octave when she told me to focus. I couldn't explain that the pressure I felt wasn't just anxiety. It was a confused, jagged desire that I was terrified to name. "She pushes the ones she respects," Sterling said, closing the file. "Or the ones she wants to break. Sometimes I can't tell the difference with her." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. the safety of his presence wrapped around me, a temporary shelter from the storm. But the hospital doesn't allow for shelters. Above us, the intercom system crackled to life, the static hiss preceding the announcement that always made the blood run cold. Code Trauma, Level 1, ETA 5 minutes, surgical team to the bay. The shelter dissolved. The fatigue vanished, replaced by the cold, sharp clarity of duty. I pushed off the counter, locking eyes with Sterling. We didn't need to speak. We just turned and ran toward the doors, back into the ice. The doors to the trauma bay exploded inward, not with a mechanical hiss, but with the violent, concussive force of a war zone breaching the perimeter. The paramedics didn't walk. They ran, wheeling in 3 gurneys that carried the wreckage of a multi-vehicle collision on the interstate. Metal had met metal at 70 miles per hour, and the human bodies caught in between had paid the price. The sensory assault was instantaneous. It hit you like a physical blow, a wall of noise and smell that threatened to overwhelm your processing centers. The air, previously sterile and cold, was suddenly thick with the metallic copper tang of fresh blood, the sharp chemical burn of industrial antiseptic, and the sickeningly sweet odor of burnt rubber clinging to torn clothes. The sound was a cacophony of organized panic, the rhythmic whoosh hiss of ventilators forcing air into crushed lungs, the high-pitched, frantic beeping of cardiac monitors screaming for attention, and the controlled shouting of 20 medical professionals trying to save lives in a space designed for 10. It was a hierarchy of noise. Residents shouting for labs, nurses shouting vitals, and anesthesiologists shouting for airways. In the center of this storm stood Elias. She was the eye of the hurricane, terrifyingly still amidst the swirling chaos. She was already gowned and gloved, her eyes scanning the room with the cold calculation of a predator assessing threats. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. She pointed, and the chaos organized itself around her will. Bay 1, tension pneumothorax. Bay 2, likely splenic rupture. Vance, you're with me on Bay 3. Abdominal trauma, unstable. We're opening. I moved to her side instantly. This was where the Cold War paused, and something far more potent took over. We stepped up to the table, the patient, a young woman barely 20, pale and crashing. We didn't speak. We didn't have to. We moved like a single organism, a binary star system orbiting the gravity of the dying girl on the table. Elias's hands were a blur of efficiency. She made the incision, a clean, decisive line, and I was there with the retractors before the first drop of blood could bead. It is strange to describe surgery as intimate, but when you are elbow deep in a stranger's body with someone else, fighting to keep a heart beating, the rest of the universe dissolves. It became a dance of pure mechanics. I knew what she needed by the subtle shift of her shoulder, the way her breath hitched for a fraction of a second behind her mask. She would reach out blindly, palm open, and I would slap the exact instrument she needed into her hand with enough force to sting. It was a merger of skills, a seamless integration where my hands became extensions of hers. We were a machine built for this specific purpose, calibrated perfectly to each other's rhythm. Then, the crisis escalated. A hidden artery, nicked by a fractured rib deep in the retroperitoneum, burst. Hot, bright blood sprayed across the field, obscuring everything. The monitors screamed as the patient's pressure bottomed out. "I can't see the source," Elias hissed, the suction catheter groaning as it choked on the volume. Her composure cracked, just a hairline fracture in the ice. I didn't think. I didn't wait for orders. I saw the anatomy in my mind's eye, a 3D map of vessels and danger zones. I reached past her, my hand diving into the pool of blood, a risky blind clamp relying entirely on tactile memory. I felt the pulse, the frantic, weak thrum of life against my fingertips, and then the tear. I clamped down, my fingers finding the damaged vessel by touch alone. The spray stopped. The field cleared. I looked up, breathless. Elias was staring at me. Her hands were frozen, hovering over the open cavity. Above her mask, her gray eyes were wide, dark, and unreadable. It wasn't just relief I saw there. It was recognition. She had seen the move, risky, intuitive, and perfectly executed. For a heartbeat, amidst the carnage, we were the only two people in existence. The air between us crackled, not with the usual cold tension, but with the searing heat of shared survival. "Clamp," she said, her voice rougher than I had ever heard it. I handed it to her. She secured the vessel, her fingers brushing against my gloved hand. The contact was brief, layered in latex and blood, but I felt it all the way up my arm. It was a grounding wire snapping into place. We worked for another hour, stabilizing the impossible. We were covered in sweat, our scrubs stained, our muscles trembling from the isometric tension. But the rhythm never faltered. Finally, the last staple was placed. The adrenaline that had been sustaining me began to recede, leaving behind a hollowed-out exhaustion. I stepped back, peeling off my gloves. The noise of the trauma bay seemed to rush back in, loud and overwhelming. The war was over. The silence that follows a saved life is heavier than the noise of saving it. It's a vacuum, a sudden, jarring absence of urgency that leaves your ears ringing and your hands trembling. We stepped back from the table, the monitors now beeping a steady, rhythmic cadence that sounded like a lullaby compared to the frantic alarms of 10 minutes ago. The nurses began the cleanup, the efficient wiping away of red chaos, but I just stood there, staring at the rise and fall of the girl's chest. My gloves were peeled off, snapping wetly against the silence, and dropped into the biohazard bin. That sound, the heavy thud of bloody latex hitting plastic, signaled the end of the performance. The adrenaline that had turned my blood into jet fuel evaporated all at once, leaving me hollowed out, a marionette whose strings had been suddenly cut. I stumbled out of the OR and into the scrub room, leaning heavily against the stainless steel sink. My knees felt like water. I turned on the faucet, not to wash, but just to hear the sound of something normal, something that wasn't dying. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to scrub away the image of the open cavity, the smell of iron, the terrifying intimacy of having my hands inside another human being alongside Elias. "That was something else, Vance." The voice came from the doorway, warm and worn, like old leather. I lifted my head, water dripping from my chin, to see Dr. Sterling standing there. He had been up in the observation gallery, watching the war from the high ground. He wasn't wearing a mask, and his face was open, smiling with a mixture of pride and relief that made my throat tight. He walked into the room, not with the predatory grace of Elias, but with the heavy, comforting gait of a man who had walked these floors for 30 years. "I thought we lost her," I admitted, my voice cracking. "When that artery blew, I didn't think. I just moved." "You didn't just move. You anticipated," Sterling said, stopping just a foot away. He looked at me, really looked at me, seeing past the blood-spattered scrubs to the terrified kid underneath. "You trusted your hands. That's what makes a surgeon, kid. Not the books. The hands." I let out a shaky breath, a laugh that sounded more like a sob. The validation hit me harder than the exhaustion. For 6 months, I had been starving for approval, surviving on the scraps of Elias's cold, silent nods. Sterling's praise was a feast. I pushed off the sink, intending to walk past him to the locker room, but my legs betrayed me. I stumbled, just a fraction, a misstep of exhaustion. Sterling caught me. It wasn't a dramatic catch. He just stepped in, his arms coming up to steady me, and I collapsed into him. It wasn't a decision, it was a surrender. I wrapped my arms around his torso, burying my face in the shoulder of his white coat. It was a hug born of pure, unadulterated survival. There was no romance in it, no spark, no friction. It was the way you hug a parent after a car crash, or a soldier hugs a comrade after the shelling stops. It was an anchor in a storm that had been raging for 12 hours. I closed my eyes, breathing him in. He smelled like stale coffee, antiseptic soap, and the faint, dusty smell of old medical journals. He smelled safe, He smelled like a world where mistakes could be forgiven, where the temperature wasn't always set to freezing. His hand came up to pat my back, a rhythmic, paternal thumping that vibrated through my ribcage. "I've got you," he murmured, his voice rumbling against my ear. "You did good. You're safe." For the first time all night, my muscles unlocked. The tension that held my spine straight dissolved. I let myself be heavy. I let myself be weak. With Elias, every touch was a negotiation, a high-stakes transfer of energy that left me burned and wanting. With Sterling, touch was just gravity. It asked for nothing. It took nothing. It was a release valve for the pressure that had been building behind my eyes. I rested my forehead against the rough cotton of his scrub top, effectively hiding from the world, hiding from the lights, hiding from the expectations. I stayed there for a long moment, just breathing, letting the safety of the mentor-mentee dynamic wash over me like a warm blanket. Then, the air in the room changed. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a movement I saw, because my eyes were still closed. It was a shift in atmospheric pressure, a sudden drop in temperature that pricked the skin on the back of my neck. The warm, safe bubble of the scrub room seemed to thin, stretching tight until it snapped. The silence, which had been comforting a second ago, suddenly felt sharp, loaded, and dangerous. I opened my eyes. I pulled away from Sterling, not because I wanted to, but because the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally altered. It was a physical shift, like the air pressure dropping before a hurricane makes landfall. I turned my head toward the source of the disturbance. Dr. Elias was standing in the doorway of the adjacent sterilization room. She wasn't moving. She wasn't checking a chart or barking orders at a resident. She was just there. A statue carved out of dry ice and judgment. But it wasn't the professional judgment I was used to. It wasn't the sharp, clinical disappointment she dispensed when I fumbled a clamp or hesitated on a differential diagnosis. This was different. This was personal. Her surgical mask was down, hanging loose around her neck, revealing the sharp, tense line of her mouth. Her lips were pressed into a line so thin it looked like a scar. But her eyes were the fracture point in the glass. Usually they were steel, gray, flat, impenetrable. Now they were burning. They were dark, dilated, fixed with terrifying intensity on the point where Sterling's hand had been resting on my shoulder just a second ago. It was a look of absolute, terrifying possession. It was the look a predator gives when another predator enters its territory. It was irrational. It was unprofessional. And it sent a jolt of heat straight through my stomach that had absolutely nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sudden, violent realization that I was being watched. Sterling, bless him, was oblivious to the subtext. He saw a chief surgeon checking on her team. I saw a woman watching her property being mishandled. "Elias," Sterling said, his voice still carrying that paternal warmth, unaware that he was standing in the middle of a minefield. "Just debriefing. Hell of a save in there. Vance has good hands." Elias didn't look at him. She didn't even blink. Her gaze dragged, physically dragged, from Sterling's retreating hand up to my face. It felt like a physical touch, a rough thumb tracing the skin of my cheek, marking me. "Debriefing," she repeated. The word sounded like glass grinding in a disposal unit. "Is that what we call physical contact in the workplace now, Dr. Sterling? I must have missed that memo in the morning HR updates." The temperature in the room didn't just drop. It bottomed out. It was absolute zero. Sterling pulled his hand back fully, as if he'd been burned. The loss of his touch was immediate and cold, leaving a phantom warmth on my scrub top that suddenly felt like a target. He frowned, confusion knitting his brows. He was a smart man, a veteran of hospital politics, but he was misreading the map. He thought this was about hierarchy. He thought Elias was pulling rank, enforcing some archaic code of conduct. He didn't see the way her chest was rising and falling too fast, or the way her hands were clenched at her sides, trembling with restrained energy. "We're just tired, Evelyn," Sterling said, his tone shifting from warm to weary. He sensed the voltage, even if he didn't understand the source. "Vance did good work. She needed a minute." "She needs to be sterile," Elias snapped. The violence in her voice was quiet, contained, which made it infinitely worse. "And she needs to write her post-op notes before she collapses into anyone's arms. This is a hospital, doctor, not a lounge." Sterling looked between us. The air was so thick you could choke on it. He sighed, deciding that whatever battle was brewing here wasn't one he had the energy to fight at 3 a.m. "Right," Sterling said, stepping back. He gave me a quick, apologetic nod. "Get some rest, Vance. Good work tonight." He walked out. The door swung shut behind him with a soft, pneumatic hiss, sealing the room. The sound was final. I should have followed him. I should have mumbled a "yes, doctor," and fled to the safety of the locker room. But I couldn't move. I was pinned by the gravity of her presence. Elias didn't leave. She stepped fully into the room. The space was small, a 10 by 10 box of stainless steel and white tile, and with her in it, it felt like a coffin. She walked to the sink opposite me, blocking the only exit. She didn't look at me now. She looked at her own reflection in the chrome, her expression fracturing into something that looked painfully like a loss of control. She began to strip off her gloves. Usually, this is a mundane action. Snap, peel, toss. But the way Elias did it was violent. She grabbed the cuff of her left glove and ripped it down. Snap. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the tiled room. She peeled the latex off slowly, finger by finger, revealing the pale, elegant hand that had just saved a life. She threw the glove into the biohazard bin with a force that was entirely unnecessary. Then the right hand. Snap. She turned the faucet on. The water rushed out, loud and harsh. She shoved her hands under the stream, scrubbing at skin that was already clean. She was scrubbing too hard. Her knuckles were white, the tendons in her forearms standing out like cords. She was trying to wash something off, but it wasn't blood. It was the image of me in someone else's arms. "You look comfortable," she said. Her voice was low, barely audible over the rushing water, but it carried a vibration that rattled my teeth. "Excuse me?" I managed to whisper. My throat felt dry, like I'd swallowed ash. "With him," she said. She turned off the water. The silence that rushed back in was deafening. She didn't reach for a towel. She just stood there, water dripping from her fingertips onto the floor, staring at the drain. "You looked comfortable." "He's my mentor," I said, my voice trembling. "He was just—" "I know who he is," she cut me off. She turned slowly to face me. The mask of the chief surgeon was gone. In its place was a woman who looked like she was burning alive from the inside out. Her chest heaved, her lips were parted, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "I know exactly who he is," she whispered, and the venom in her voice was mixed with something so sweet, so dark, that my knees threatened to buckle all over again. She took a step toward me, invading my personal space, the scent of sandalwood and surgical scrub overwhelming my senses. And I know exactly where his hands were. She didn't move to let me pass. In a room this small, a tiled box designed for sterilization and silence, space is a finite resource, and Dr. Elias was consuming all of it. She stood directly in front of the pneumatic door, her body a rigid line of obstruction. The usual professional distance, that invisible 2-foot barrier that separates attending from resident, had evaporated. She was close enough that I could count the individual lashes framing her furious eyes, close enough to see the pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against the delicate skin of her throat. "I don't care about the optics, Vance," she said, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated in the floorboards. "I care about the access." "Access?" I stammered, my back pressing against the cold stainless steel of the sink. The word felt clinical, surgical, but the way she said it tasted like smoke. "You let him hold you like you were fragile," she accused, stepping closer. Her eyes swept over me, dissecting my posture, my exhaustion, the way I was still trembling slightly. You let him wrap you up in that mediocrity. You collapsed into him. You surrendered. I was exhausted, I defended, though my voice lacked any real conviction. It was a moment of relief. He's safe. Safe, she repeated, the word leaving her mouth like a curse. She laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that bounced off the tiles. Is that what you want? Safety? You want to be patted on the head and told you did a good job, like a golden retriever? She slammed her hand against the metal towel dispenser next to my head. The sound was a thunderclap in the small room, making me jump. She didn't flinch. She leaned in, trapping me in the cage of her arms without actually touching me. You are not safe, Vance. You are dangerous. I watched you in there tonight. I watched you slide your hand into a chest cavity blindly and find a bleeder by instinct alone. You have hands that move with an intelligence that terrifies me. You have a mind that cuts sharper than any instrument on my tray. You are a weapon. Her gaze dropped to my hands, then back to my eyes, burning with a mixture of admiration and fury. And seeing you surrender that power, seeing you go soft and pliable in the arms of a man who hasn't performed a relevant surgery in a decade, it was insulting. My breath caught in my throat. It was a compliment wrapped in barbed wire. She wasn't angry that I was unprofessional. She was angry that I had given someone else the vulnerability she felt she had earned. She was jealous not of the affection, but of the surrender. It wasn't like that, I whispered. The air between us was becoming thin, hot, charged with static. It didn't mean anything. It meant everything, she snapped, her composure finally shattering completely. The Ice Queen melted, and underneath was a woman consumed by fire. Do you think I don't see it? Do you think I don't notice every time you walk into a room? Do you think I don't track your vitals on the monitors just as closely as the patients? She was breathing hard now, her chest rising and falling in sync with mine. The sterile smell of the hospital was gone, replaced by the scent of her, sandalwood, expensive soap, and the pheromonal spike of pure adrenaline. I stood there, she said, her voice trembling, stripping away the last layers of her rank. And I watched him touch you. I watched his hands on your shoulders. I watched you close your eyes and lean into him. And I felt... She stopped, shaking her head as if trying to dislodge the thought. She looked at me, her eyes wide and dark, filled with a terrifying honesty. I felt a violence I didn't know I was capable of. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought she must be able to hear it. This wasn't a reprimand. This was a confession. Dr. Elias. Don't, she warned, her voice cracking. She looked at the ceiling, blinking rapidly, fighting a losing battle against her own emotions. When she looked back down at me, the anger was gone, replaced by a raw, naked misery that knocked the wind out of me. I hate it, she admitted, the words tumbling out in a rush. I hate that I stopped writing my notes just to watch you scrub out. I hate that I know exactly how you take your coffee. I hate that when you walked into that trauma bay, the only thing I could think about was keeping you alive. She took one final step, closing the remaining distance until our bodies were inches apart. I could feel the heat radiating off her, a physical force. She looked at my mouth, then up to my eyes, her expression tortured. And God help me, she whispered. I hate that I care who touches you. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the empty silence of the hospital. It was the heavy, loaded silence of a bomb that had just been diffused. The confession hung between us, shimmering and real. The realization hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't cold because she felt nothing. She was cold because she felt everything, and she was terrified of the heat. The fear in my own chest evaporated, replaced instantly by a surge of adrenaline that had nothing to do with surgery. The Ice Queen wasn't trying to freeze me out. She was burning up, and she had just admitted that I was the match. The anger that had been fueling her evaporated the moment the words left her mouth. It didn't fade gradually. It vanished instantly, like a flame starved of oxygen, leaving behind a vacuum that was immediately filled by something far more volatile. The air in the small, tiled room seemed to thicken, becoming a medium that transmitted every tiny movement, every shift in weight, every hitch in breath. She stood there, chest heaving, eyes wide and glassy, waiting for the verdict. She had effectively handed me a scalpel and bared her throat. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the sterilization units next door and the ragged rhythm of our breathing. The Ice Queen had melted, but what was left wasn't water. It was gasoline. She looked down at her own hands, the hands that had saved a life an hour ago, and then lifted her gaze to mine. The professional mask was gone, stripped away to reveal a raw, terrifying hunger. "I watched you tonight," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt louder than a shout in the confined space. "I watched the way you moved during the crisis, the way you ignored my hesitation and dove in. It was arrogant." She took a half step closer, invading the last few inches of neutral territory. The scent of sandalwood and antiseptic soap was overwhelming now, a sensory overload that made my head spin. "It was the most arrogant, beautiful thing I have ever seen," she murmured. "You have these hands, these capable, dangerous hands, and watching you use them, watching you take control of that room." She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to my lips. "It makes me want to ruin you." The compliment hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't the safe, paternal praise Sterling had offered. It was a challenge. It was an acknowledgement of my power, not just my competence. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat that I knew she could hear. "Dr. Elias," I started, but the title felt wrong in my mouth. It felt like a lie, a flimsy shield that had already been shattered. "Don't," she interrupted softly. "We are past titles. We are past the point where I can pretend I am just your attending and you are just my resident." She raised her hand. It was a slow, deliberate movement, the kind of precise motion she used when navigating a critical vessel. Her fingers, usually so steady, had a microscopic tremor. She reached toward my face, but she didn't make contact. She stopped an inch from my skin, her palm hovering near my jawline. The heat radiating from her hand was palpable, a ghost touch that made my nerves fire in anticipation. She froze there, caught in the space between desire and duty. Her eyes locked onto mine, searching for a signal, a sign, a permission slip. "I need to touch you," she said. The words were stark, clinical in their precision, but devastating in their intent. "I need to verify that this heat isn't just in my head. But I am your superior. I am your chief, so you need to tell me, right now." Her eyes were unflinching, demanding absolute clarity in the chaos. "If I cross this line, Vance, there is no scrubbing back out. There is no going back to the way things were. Tell me to stop, and I will walk out that door and never speak of this again." It was a boundary check. It was the most erotic thing I had ever heard, because it was respectful, and because it acknowledged the danger. She was giving me the power of veto. She was handing me the controls. I looked at her. I saw the exhaustion etched under her eyes, the fear of rejection, and the naked, terrifying desire that she had been suppressing for months. I realized then that the safety I felt with Sterling was comfort, but this friction, this heat, this terrifying drop, this was life. I didn't want to be safe. I wanted to burn. "Don't you dare stop," I whispered. The permission snapped the last tether of restraint. Her hand closed the distance. Her fingers made contact with my jaw, skin on skin, devoid of latex, devoid of barriers. The feeling was electric, a sudden grounding shock that zapped through my entire nervous system. Her skin was hot, calloused from years of scrubbing, and incredibly firm. She didn't just touch me, she claimed the space. Her thumb traced the line of my cheekbone, a slow, possessive mapping of territory that made my knees weak. "God," she breathed, the word vibrating against my skin. "You're real." She stepped in, her body pressing against mine, pinning me against the cold stainless steel of the sink. The contrast was jarring, the freezing metal against my back and the searing heat of her body against my front. It was a collision of extremes. Her other hand came up to tangle in the hair at the nape of my neck, her grip tight, desperate. "I have wanted to do this," she murmured, her forehead resting against mine, our breaths mingling in the small space. "Since the day you walked into my OR and corrected my suture line." "You gave me a formal reprimand for that," I gasped, my hands finding purchase on her waist, feeling the rigid muscles of her back through the thin scrub top. "I had to," she whispered, tilting her head so her lips brushed against the sensitive spot below my ear. I was terrified of how much I liked it. The power dynamic in the room shifted tectonically. She was no longer the untouchable chief surgeon on a pedestal. She was a woman unraveling in my arms, shaking with the force of her own want. And I wasn't the subordinate anymore. I was the cause. I was the catalyst. The realization flooded through me. She wasn't controlling this. We were calibrating it together. And for the first time, I realized that the control she gripped so tightly wasn't to keep me out. It was to keep herself from consuming me whole. The vibration running through her frame wasn't just desire, it was terror. I could feel it in the rigid tension of her shoulders under my hands, in the way her breath hitched and stalled in her throat. For a woman who commanded operating theaters with the absolute authority of a monarch, this unscripted, messy, desperate collision of bodies was a loss of control that must have felt like a free fall without a parachute. She was holding on to me not just to pull me closer, but to keep herself from shattering. She was the chief. She was the architect of this entire department. She was the one who made the incisions, who decided what was cut and what was saved. But right now, trembling in the fluorescent hum of the scrub room, she didn't know what to do with her hands. That realization hit me with the clarity of a diagnostic breakthrough. She wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid of herself. She was afraid of the sheer volume of want she had been suppressing, terrified that if she let go of the wheel, she would crash us both. "You're scared," I whispered. It wasn't a question. "I am never scared," she lied, but the tremble in her bottom lip betrayed her. "I am calibrated." "No," I said, and the shift in my voice made her eyes widen. It was a drop in register, a sudden assumption of command that I hadn't planned but felt instinctively right. "You're terrified. You're used to being the one holding the scalpel. You're used to being the operator. You don't know how to be the patient." I didn't wait for her to argue. I moved. I took a step forward, a deliberate, predatory encroachment into the sliver of space she had left. Instinctively, she stepped back. Then, another step. I followed, matching her movement, pushing the boundary until her hips hit the edge of the stainless steel sink with a dull, metallic thud. The sound seemed to echo the sudden shift in our dynamic. The predator was now the prey. "Vance," she gasped, her hands coming up to rest on my chest, flat palms that could have pushed me away but instead clutched at the fabric of my scrub top. "What are you doing?" "Calibrating," I murmured. I reached out and took her wrists. Her pulse was hammering against my fingertips, a frantic, staccato rhythm that told me everything she wouldn't say. I moved her hands from my chest and pinned them back against the cool tile on either side of her hips. It wasn't forceful. It was a suggestion of restraint, a physical manifestation of the surrender she was fighting against. "Let go, Evelyn," I said, using her first name like a weapon. "You don't have to drive, not right now. You don't have to be the chief. You don't have to be the genius. You just have to be here." She stared at me, her chest heaving. The conflict in her gray eyes was a war between the habit of command and the desperate need for release. I could see her trying to solve this situation like a complex algorithm, trying to find the variable that would put her back on top. "I don't know how," she admitted, her voice barely a ghost of sound. "I don't know how to turn it off." "Then let me do it for you." I leaned in, eliminating the last inch of distance. I didn't kiss her immediately. I let the anticipation do the work. I brushed my lips against the sensitive cord of her neck, feeling her shiver violently against me. I traced the line of her jaw with my nose, inhaling the scent of her, that intoxicating mix of expensive perfume and raw, honest sweat. I was unlocking a vault that had been sealed for years, twisting the tumblers one by one. "You watch everyone," I whispered against her skin. "You analyze everything. You dissect every weakness. But you're the one who's wide open right now." "Elisa," she breathed my name like a plea. I kissed her. It wasn't tentative. It was a claiming. I kissed her with all the frustration and desire that had been building for 6 months of night shifts and cold shoulders. I kissed her until I felt her knees buckle, until the rigid tension in her spine snapped, and she melted against me, heavy and pliable. Her hands, which I had released, didn't push me away. They flew to my hair, gripping tight, pulling me closer as if she wanted to merge our skeletons. For a woman made of ice, she burned with a terrifying intensity. She made a sound in the back of her throat, a low, desperate whimper that had no place in a hospital, and opened to me completely. It was a total system failure of her defenses. The algorithm was solved. The logic had crashed. We were a tangle of limbs and heat in a room designed for sterility. I pressed closer, feeling the curve of her body against mine, the way she fit perfectly into the spaces I hadn't known were empty. It was messy. It was unprofessional. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. But then, the reality of our location rushed back in. The pneumatic hiss of the OR doors opening down the hall, the squeak of rubber shoes on linoleum, voices carrying over the intercom. We were in a scrub room. Anyone, a nurse, a resident, Sterling, could walk in. I pulled back, breathless, my lips swollen and tingling. Elias was flushed, her eyes blown wide and dark, her mouth red and bitten. She looked thoroughly, beautifully ruined. She looked at the door, then back at me, the haze of lust clearing just enough for the logistical panic to set in. "We can't," she gasped, her hand tightening on my arm. "Not here. The shift change. The nurses." "I know," I said, though my body was screaming in protest. "I need..." She swallowed hard, trying to regain some semblance of the chief surgeon, but failing miserably. She looked at me with a vulnerability that made my chest ache. "I need you. Alone. Somewhere where I don't have to worry about who's watching." "The on-call room," I suggested, the words heavy with implication. "The one in the East Wing. It's undergoing renovation. No one goes there." She nodded, a sharp, jerky movement. "Go. I'll follow in 2 minutes. If we walk together..." "I know," I repeated. "Optics. Survival," she corrected, her eyes dark. "Go. Before I change my mind and take you right here on the sink." The East Wing of St. Jude's was a ghost town, a labyrinth of plastic sheeting and drywall dust where the hospital was trying to reinvent itself. The air here didn't smell like antiseptic. It smelled like chalk and old copper pipes. It was a liminal space, existing somewhere between the hospital's past and its future. And right now, it was the only place on Earth where we could cease to exist as doctors. I found the on-call room by memory. It was a narrow, windowless cell with a single twin mattress and a flickering fluorescent light that hummed in a dying minor key. I didn't turn it on. The light filtering in from the hallway through the frosted glass of the door was enough, casting long, gray shadows that made the room feel underwater. I waited in the dark, my heart beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs, listening to the silence. Then the handle turned. The door opened and closed in a single, fluid motion. The lock clicked, a sharp, mechanical sound that severed us from the rest of the world. Elias stood with her back against the door, breathing hard. In the dim light, stripped of the harsh glare of the trauma bay, she looked younger. The sharp lines of her face were softened by the shadows, and the armor of the chief surgeon had been left out in the corridor. She wasn't the woman who terrified interns. She was just Evelyn. "I checked the schedule," she whispered, her voice rough. Security doesn't round here until 4. That gives us 40 minutes, I said. Then we shouldn't waste them. She pushed off the door and crossed the small room. There was no hesitation now, no calibration. She moved with the same decisive energy she brought to a crashing patient, but the target was me. She didn't kiss me immediately. She stopped inches away, her hands coming up to cup my face, her thumbs tracing the dark circles under my eyes. "You're exhausted," she murmured. "So are you." "Yes," she admitted. "But I'm not tired." She kissed me then, and it wasn't the frantic collision of the scrub room. It was slow, deep, and devastatingly thorough. It tasted like surrender. I felt the tension leaving her body in waves, the rigid posture of the last 12 hours melting into a heavy, fluid heat. We fumbled with the scrub tops, the sterile blue cotton suddenly feeling like chainmail that needed to be shed. When her skin finally met mine, shoulders, collarbones, the curve of a waist, it felt like coming up for air after being submerged for years. We moved to the narrow bed, the springs protesting under our weight. The darkness of the room made the other senses sharper. I could hear the catch in her breath when my hand grazed her ribcage. I could smell the sandalwood and the salt on her skin. I could feel the terrifying strength in her hands as she pulled me closer, as if she were trying to suture us together. "I have to tell you," she whispered against my neck, her voice trembling. "It wasn't just tonight." "What?" I asked, my hand tangled in her hair, grounding her. "I've been watching you for months, since you started." She pulled back slightly, needing me to see her eyes in the gloom. "Everyone talks about your potential, but I watched your hands. Do you remember the Whipple procedure on the senator 3 months ago?" "I was just second assist," I said, breathless. "I barely did anything." "You anticipated the bleed before the clamp was even on the tray. I saw your hand twitch. I saw you reach for the suction before I even asked." Her eyes were dark, intense, burning with a specific intellectual lust that was more intimate than any touch. That was the moment. It wasn't your smile, Elisa. It wasn't your laugh. It was your competence. It was the terrifying efficiency of your mind. It was the most erotic thing anyone had ever said to me. To be seen, truly dissected and understood, by the most exacting woman I had ever known was a drug. She didn't want me because I was soft or safe. She wanted me because I was her equal. "I thought you hated me," I confessed, my thumb brushing her lip. "I thought I was failing." "You were never failing," she said, closing her eyes as she leaned into my touch. "I was just terrified, because I recognized myself in you, and I knew if I let you in, you would be the one thing I couldn't control." "You don't have to control me," I whispered. "I know," she breathed. "That's why I'm here." The rest of the world fell away. There was no hospital, no hierarchy, no protocols. There was just the friction of skin, the heat of the small room, and the profound relief of finally putting down the weight we had both been carrying. It was a merger of two high-pressure systems, violent and beautiful and necessary. I held her, and for the first time, the chief surgeon let herself be held. She unraveled in my arms, not broken, but open. We lay there for a long time in the afterglow, the silence of the room heavy and sweet. The dust motes danced in the sliver of light from the door. Her head was resting on my chest, her breathing slowly syncing with mine. Then, faintly, through the walls, I heard it. The distant, rhythmic beep, beep, beep of a cardiac monitor from the floor below. The hum of the ventilation system kicking on. The world was waking up. The sanctuary was expiring. Elias stiffened against me. The armor was trying to reassemble itself. "It's time," she whispered, the regret in her voice palpable. "I know," I said, tightening my arm around her for just one more second. "Back to the ice." "No," she said, lifting her head to look at me. Her expression was guarded, but the fire was still there, burning quietly behind the gray. "Not ice. Not anymore." The morning sun cut through the blinds of the surgical floor, turning the floating dust motes into suspended gold. We had emerged from the East Wing separately, staggered by exactly 3 minutes, a calculated, necessary gap to preserve the fragile illusion of professional distance. But as I walked back onto the main floor, the air felt fundamentally different. The sterile, recycled chill that usually seeped into my bones at 6 in the morning was gone, replaced by a phantom warmth that lingered on my skin, a secret heat source radiating from the memory of the last hour. The hospital was shifting gears around me. The night shift ghosts were fading, replaced by the crisp, caffeinated energy of the day team. I stood at the nurses' station, signing off my charts, my hands steady for the first time in 12 hours. The chaos of the trauma bay felt like a lifetime ago. "You look awake." Dr. Sterling's voice came from behind me. I turned. He was holding 2 coffees, offering me one with that familiar paternal kindness. Yesterday, that cup would have been a lifeline. Yesterday, his presence was the only shelter I had against the storm. I took the cup, the cardboard warm against my palm, but the desperate need for his protection had evaporated. "The adrenaline hasn't worn off yet," I lied smoothly, taking a sip. The bitter roast grounded me, but it didn't settle the flutter in my chest. "Elias was looking for you," he said, watching me over the rim of his glasses. There was a question in his eyes, a lingering confusion about the tense scene in the scrub room earlier. She seemed intense, even for her. "We sorted it out," I said. It was the truth, though not the version he would ever read in a personnel file. "We just needed to recalibrate the protocol regarding trauma responses." Sterling nodded slowly, sensing a shift in the atmosphere he couldn't quite name. He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't see a tired resident needing a hug to hold her up. He saw a surgeon standing firmly on her own 2 feet. "Good. She's brilliant, Vance, but she's a fortress. Don't let her freeze you out." I smiled, a small, private expression that I hid behind the coffee cup. "She won't." At that moment, the elevator doors at the far end of the hall slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Dr. Elias stepped out, flanked by 3 nervous interns and the chief of medicine. She was armor-clad again, lab coat pristine, hair pulled back into that severe, perfect knot, posture rigid enough to deflect bullets. The Ice Queen had returned to her throne, complete with the entourage. She walked down the corridor, her heels clicking a sharp, authoritative rhythm that silenced the casual conversations around her. The air seemed to tighten as she moved, a gravitational pull that I was no longer resisting, but orbiting. As she passed the nurses' station, she didn't stop. She didn't break stride. To the casual observer, she didn't even look at me, but I saw it. Just as she passed, her hand brushed the edge of the counter near my elbow. It was a breach of sterile protocol, intentional and electric, a meaningless gesture to anyone else, but her eyes flicked to mine for a fraction of a second, gray, piercing, and burning with a shared, magnificent secret. She tapped her index finger twice against the metal chart she was holding. 2 taps. "I see you. I have you." It was a new language, a silent frequency, broadcasting on a channel only we could tune into. The Cold War was over. The hospital was still a battlefield, a place of blood and high stakes and freezing temperatures. But as she disappeared around the corner, leading her team into the morning rounds, I realized the fundamental truth of the new protocol. I wasn't fighting against her anymore. We were fighting together. And in this frozen kingdom, that was the most dangerous advantage of all. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing the moment. But the reflection in the glass caught my eye. I didn't look like the exhausted resident anymore. I saw a woman loved by the most dangerous person in the room. The fear of the forbidden had burned away, replaced by the exhilaration of being known. If you've ever found heat in the coldest places, subscribe to follow the legacy we're building.